Welcome to this class on controversial issues. This is the first in a 5-week class. We're going to look at 5 extremely controversial issues, not only within the religious communities, but within society at large. These will be, tonight, abortion, right to life. Next week, human sexuality, gay and transgender issues. Week 3, capital punishment. Week 4, suicide and the right to die. And 5, the question of just war. Not just war, but a just war. So as I think you can see, there's some pretty heavy issues here, very controversial. And I want to emphasize right from the beginning that I am going to take as an objective position as possible. I'm not here to argue for one side or the other. The real purpose of this class is to give you information. Roughly, if we divided the class, we could go into 3 sections. Each one will start with sort of a history, some background information, a lot of it from the United States, but others stretching further afield. Then the main arguments for a position and the main arguments against the position. So like I said, the purpose is to disseminate information. Do you remember when, I don't know if they still do this, but was it the League of Women Voters used to go over the propositions, and they would just tell you from the best of their objective ability what they each meant. That's all I'm going to do. And when we get questions later at the end, I would appreciate it if we sort of followed that sort of policy. I don't want anyone getting up and saying, well, this is this and this is this. I mean, you're welcome to have that, but that's not the purpose. If anything, sometimes what's good about these sorts of, if you approach things this way, ask yourself to put yourself in the position that you're opposed to and try and argue for it the best you can. That's often done in law schools, for example. When I was trained in Socratic teaching, it's done that way. That way you give it a fair shot. You know what a straw man is? A straw man argument is when you set something up that's easy to knock down, so you take the weakest argument that you can find of a given position and knock it down. The best way to, I think, approach this is to try and find, is there anything in the other position that makes sense? We tend to be, I'm getting a little bit off now, but I'm going to say this anyway. We're a little bit, you notice in society, we're either or right now in just about everything. We don't want to give anybody the benefit of the doubt. We don't want to see that maybe somebody has something positive on their side. It's either all right or all wrong. That usually causes a lot of problems for societies, for individuals at any level. So we're trying to avoid that, but we do want to spread as much information as we can. So tonight we're going to be looking at abortion, a right to life issue, and let's start with some history. Christianity and abortion have a long and complex history. A variety of positions have been taken by various Christian denominations. That should tell you something right there. Okay? Not everyone, even within the Christian world, agrees. There's no explicit statement about abortion in either the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. No explicit. There are inferences which people make, and I'll give you some examples. And these inferences, strangely enough, some find inferences one way, some find inferences the other way. Let me give you some examples. But what they tend to center around, and this is the main question I think to keep in mind through this whole issue, and that is, when is human life said to begin? That's the core question around which all the positions really revolve. So from, let's say, the Hebrew Bible, there's Jeremiah 1:5, which says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I dedicated you. A prophet to the nations, I appointed you." Christians opposed to legalized abortion have interpreted this passage to mean that life begins prior to birth. You see why? Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Thus making abortion the taking of a person's life. So that's a passage that's taken and that's interpreted in a certain way. Then there's Genesis 2:7. God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being. Opposite position takes this one. Advocates of abortion rights cite this passage as proof that human personhood begins once the breath of life enters the body and not before. And since lungs of the fetus are not considered fully functioning until 36 weeks and cannot breathe until birth, infant's personhood does not begin at conception. Let's look at the New Testament. Luke 1:41. And it came to pass that when Elizabeth heard the salutation of Mary, the infant leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Ghost. Those opposed to legalized abortion point to this verse of Elizabeth's pregnancy with her son, future John the Baptist, as showing that the fetus was a person. Because the fetus was filled with the Holy Spirit in the womb and leapt for joy at the sound of Mary's salutation. Supporters of abortion rights argue that the passage explains the uniqueness of John the Baptist and nothing about fetal life in general. You see, you can always take a passage and probably find a way. I think the word that's sometimes used is spin, but that's kind of overt. But find a way to see how it fits into a given interpretation. So the reason I raise this is, yes, people will quote scripture all the time, but they'll, as in most issues, you can find some people quoting it one way, other people quoting it another way. And of course, in the Protestant, one of the problems in the Protestant world is who is the final interpreter. I mean, at least the Catholics say that the church interprets. So we'll get back to that in a moment. Okay. So there are just as probably as many perspectives on this from taking scripture as there are positions. So let's get to the Catholic Church. Opposition to abortion stems from the belief that human life is sacred and must be respected and protected absolutely. Accordingly, it opposes procedures whose purpose is to destroy an embryo or fetus. Fetus is after 9 weeks. For whatever motive, and they would add even before implantation. That's why they're anti-contraceptive. The latter supports this position, goes back to St. Augustine, 4th century, who saw the purpose of contraception as to destroy a possible embryo. Now, of course, this is something we might discuss later in some detail. Is destroying an actual embryo different than destroying a possible embryo? Try and think about that one. Because statistically, you could argue that if there was no contraception, there would be a large number of births. Canon 1398, if you're interested in the Catholic canon law, states that, quote, a person who procures a successful abortion incurs an automatic excommunication. which can only be removed when that individual seeks penance and obtains absolution from a bishop. That's the law. The law is often skirted, as you know, not only religiously but that's the law. That's the canon law. And the church declares that the catechism of the church has not changed since the first century and remains unchangeable. Whenever you make a statement that something is unchangeable, that cements your position. I mean, if you said it, at one time it wasn't allowed, but now it is, but once it, however, a number of church historians question the viability of this statement. They point out that abortion before quickening was not prohibited by the Catholic canon law until 1869. So what is quickening? Quickening is the moment in pregnancy when the woman starts to feel the fetus move. That's called the quickening. It's usually about 3 months. So many historians have pointed out that before 1869, and I'll get there in a moment, it was always held that the quickening established when life began, not the moment of the egg and sperm meeting. Yeah. So in 1869, Pope Pius IX, without making any distinction about the stage of pregnancy, listed those who effectively procured an abortion as subject to excommunication, which I mentioned earlier, from only which a bishop could give absolution. Now, even there's been some interpretation. Some have interpreted this as not Pius declaring all abortions are homicide. Others only that it leads to excommunication. There's always room for a little bit of, and have you ever tried to work, have you read a legal document? You wonder why they're so long and so, because it is so easy to spin words unless you just have it so exactly laid out. I think my father-in-law said when he sold his first house in Burbank after the war, the contract was 1 page. It basically said, I agree to buy, you agree to sell. You ever bought a house lately? Yeah. Okay. So, in the 20th century, the debate over the morality of abortion became one of several issues which divided and continues to divide Protestant denominations. Catholics are pretty clear, at least from not all Catholics agree, but I'm saying from the institutional perspective. Thus, Protestant views on abortion vary considerably, and they can be found in both, you can find Protestants in anti-abortion positions and abortion rights positions. A generalization, conservative Protestants tend to be anti-abortion, whereas mainline, more progressive Protestants tend to be abortion rights, but even that's not absolute. Even among Protestants who believe that abortion should be a legal option, there are those who believe it is nonetheless morally unacceptable in most instances. I don't know if Bill Clinton's the right man to quote, but he said abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. So there you may find a number of Protestants who will support it, but say you got to have all these sort of reasons that are legitimate, and we'll be looking at some of those. Other Protestants, most notably amongst the evangelicals, have sought to sharply restrict the conditions under which abortion is legally available, and we'll be talking a little bit when I get to the secular side of things down the road and the Supreme Court, etc. So what does the United Methodist Church say? This comes from the Book of Discipline. Our belief in the sanctity of unborn human life makes us reluctant, this sounds Methodist, doesn't it? Reluctant to approve abortion. Now, when you're reluctant isn't an absolute statement. But I think Reverend Kim's listening somewhere in here. He knows he always talks about the Methodists trying to find the middle path in a lot of these things, which is, anyway. But we are equally bound to respect the sacredness of the life and well-being of the mother, for whom devastating damage may result from an unacceptable pregnancy. Now notice that devastating damage is not necessarily said to be physical. It might be psychological. I mean, that's pretty loose language at this point. In continuity with past Christian teaching, we recognize the tragic conflicts of life that may justify abortion or rape. And in such cases, we support the legal option of abortion under proper medical procedures. We cannot affirm abortion as an acceptable means of birth control, and we unconditionally reject it as a means of gender selection, which is happening in many countries around the world. And you know who's getting the brunt of it? Females. Yeah. I should note, however, the 2016 General Conference voted by a margin of 425 to 268 to withdraw from the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. What that probably reflects is the larger conservative, progressive conflict going on in the church in general, covering other issues than this. Probably the southern, midwestern elements versus the west. So they withdrew from that. Let's see here. Churches that have supported abortion: United Church of Christ, Episcopal Church, Presbyterian Church USA, the Lutheran Women's Caucus. The American Baptist churches and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America consider abortion permissible under certain very restricted circumstances, such as possible death of the mother, I think rape. Okay. So you can see there are a variety of positions here. So, that's sort of the religious. Let's turn to secular law. In the 19th century, social attitudes towards abortion began to shift dramatically. Abortion in early pregnancy had previously been widely practiced and legal under common law, both in England and in the United States, until the quickening. That was, up until the 19th century, the quickening was generally the mark of when life began. That started to change dramatically in the 19th century. In the United States, physicians, doctors, were the leading advocates of abortion criminalization. Everyone's going, Some of them argue that advances in medical knowledge showed that quickening was neither more nor less crucial in the process of gestation than any other step. And thus, if one opposed abortion after quickening, one should oppose it before quickening as well. In other words, they got rid of the quickening position and went back to the point of conception. There were some practical reasons as well that influenced the medical field. For one, abortion providers tended to be untrained and not members of medical societies. In an age where the leading doctors in the nation were attempting to standardize the medical profession, these irregulars were considered a nuisance to public health. In addition, a number of scholars see the anti-abortion shift in the context of a backlash against the women's movement, which started in the early 19th and in the United States picked up in the mid-19th century. Anti-abortion statutes began to appear in the United States from the 1820s. In 1821, a Connecticut law targeted those who sold potions to women for the purpose of an abortion. And in New York, made post-quickening abortions a felony and pre-quickening abortions a misdemeanor. What's interesting here, if you look at the history, these things evolve. It's not like this is how it is, and these things change over time, and they move. And then there was, in 1873, the Comstock Law. Has anyone heard of the Comstock Law? It was a federal law, prohibited any methods of production or publication of information pertaining to the procurement of abortion and the prevention of conception. You could not put anything in the mail that advocated either abortion or contraception. That was illegal federally. By 1909, the penalty was $5,000 fine and 5 years in prison. And by 1910, nearly every state in the Union had some form of anti-abortion law. So in the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th was when we get this real shift. Before that, it was more or less a woman's choice. It was seen to be around the quickening. Things began to change. To many feminists of this era, abortion was regarded as an undesirable necessity forced upon women by thoughtless men. Even the free love wing of the feminist movement, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that, refused to support abortion or advocate it, let's put it that way, to advocate it, and treated the practice as an example of the hideous extremes to which modern marriage was driving women. This is where the first time you get something called marital rape. Women were claiming marital rape, which meant that if they refused and their husband forced them, that's not rape. I think, I'm not sure what the situation is now. I think you can claim that in certain states. Yeah. If you're forced to have sex against your will, even by your husband, and that's what a lot of women were saying, we've had 8 kids. We don't want any more. Yeah. And the women's movement took this up. And the socialist feminists tended to be more sympathetic to abortion for the poor. And this is where it becomes a socioeconomic issue and will continue to be, as we'll see down the line, especially if the court makes some decisions coming up, which it may well make. We'll talk about that in a moment. Those who tend to take the brunt are the poor. And we'll talk about that in a moment. The movement to liberalize abortion laws emerged in the 1920s and 30s as part of feminist activism, which had already resulted in victories in the area of birth control. First battle they fought was birth control, contraception. Second would be abortion. Campaigners including Marie Stopes in England, Margaret Sanger in the United States, had succeeded in bringing the issue out into the open. Birth control clinics were established, which offered family planning advice, contraceptive methods, etc. And you can see how that would then lead into supporting abortion, not across the board, but in certain situations. But it was not until the 1960s that a powerful abortion reform movement emerged in the United States. So it's relatively new. 1967, Colorado became the first state to decriminalize a doctor performing an abortion in cases of rape, incest, or in which pregnancy would lead to the physical disability of the mother. A doctor performing an abortion under those circumstances could not be brought to trial as this was not a criminal case. Also in 1967, California, who was governor at the time? Ronald Reagan, yes. Passed a law which decriminalized abortions when done to protect the health of the mother. So when abortions start to become acceptable is when it deals with the health of the mother. That's sort of the first step. 1970, Hawaii became the first state to legalize abortions on the request of the woman, not the doctor. And New York repealed its 1830 law and allowed abortions up to the 24th week of pregnancy. By the end of 1972, 13 states had laws similar to that of Colorado. So the number of states. And then there, of course, is January 1973. Roe versus Wade. The landmark judicial ruling of the Supreme Court. What did it rule? It ruled that a Texas statute forbidding abortion except when necessary to save the life of the mother was unconstitutional. You couldn't restrict it. The immediate result was that all state laws contrary became null and void. What was the court's position? The court arrived at its decision by concluding that the issue of abortion and abortion rights falls under the right to privacy. This is a secular decision. This isn't a religious. This is the right to privacy under the Constitution. A mother had a right to abortion until viability. A point to be determined by the doctor. After viability, a woman could obtain an abortion for health reasons, which the court defined broadly to include psychological well-being. So it was a very, boom. This opened the door. And of course, whenever you open a door, you're going to get a reaction. When you really open it wide. Since Roe v. Wade, parameters for the states by the Supreme Court have been subject to change and reversal as the composition of the court has changed. Now, they're not getting rid of Roe v. Wade, but they're... Yeah. So the court has given states wide discretion in the areas of paying for abortions for women who are eligible for Medicaid, with the result that 30 states provide no abortion funding unless a Medicaid patient's life is in danger. So let's see, that's one restriction. Other restrictions have included the requirement of the performance of specified tests before an abortion can occur. For example, a state-mandated counseling meeting in which pictures are shown. A prohibition on the use of public facilities for abortions. So I'm not all states. These are some of the things that different states have brought in. A prohibition on public employees participating in the performance of an abortion. Allowing individual health care providers to refuse to participate in abortion. In California, there are virtually no restrictions before viability, and viability is only after viability only if the mother's life is in danger. Okay, so that's a bit of the historical background. Now, as you know, this issue is probably going to come before the court again, and my own reading is they're not going to tank it, but they're probably going to give more and more to the states, more and more decision-making to the states. Which is fine, I mean, for wealthy people. I mean, how did people get abortions here before Roe v. Wade? They went to Europe, but you had to be able to afford to go there. Okay? If, let's say abortion will stay the same in California, but not in Alabama. A person from, and this holds right now in California, someone from out of state can get an abortion here. So you'd have to come from Alabama to California to get it. What does that automatically do? It hits the poor. So, and anyway, okay. So that's sort of the history. Let's take a look at the arguments that you have in front of you, pro and con. These lists are taken from a variety of pro and con websites. I just sort of assembled them. Some of them appear to me more solid than the others, but I've tried to list a wide range because these are the sort of arguments you'll come across if you're looking around. So let's start with the pro-life arguments. I will say more than is just on your page. Those are the main points. Each one of these I'll elaborate on a bit. So number one, since life begins at conception, that's the assumption, abortion is akin to murder, as it is the act of taking human life. Abortion is in direct defiance of the commonly accepted idea of the sanctity of human life. And as we saw in our survey, the question of when a human life begins is an essential one in the abortion debate. The pro-life position can be summed up as follows. You don't have this. At the completion of the process of fertilization, the human creature emerges as a whole. I'm still under point one. I'll tell you when I get to point two. Okay. Generally distinct, individuated, zygotic, living human organism, a member of the species Homo sapiens at the moment of conception, at one cell, needing only the proper environment in order to grow and develop. The difference between the individual in its adult stage, that's you, and its zygotic stage, which is the moment of conception, is not one of personhood, but development. Okay, so from the moment of conception, that is a human being from a religious point of view, probably soul, and all that matters from that point is development. It's not any different than you. If that's your position, can you see why getting rid of that would be considered homicide? No, I'm just giving these arguments. Okay? No civilized society permits one human to intentionally harm or take the life of another without punishment, and abortion is no different. Here the argument is that abortion is a willful act equivalent to homicide and should be dealt with as any other act of homicide, although not necessarily first degree. Okay. It's interesting, we have, the law always splits, thou shalt not murder. Well, there's first degree murder, there's second degree murder, there's murder under because life's more complicated than boom, generally. There's also the accompanying implication that punishment acts as a deterrent, which is another interesting position. Questions do arise, however, as to the relative responsibility of the doctor versus the mother. Is the doctor responsible for homicide? Is the mother responsible for homicide? Okay. Second, so that's the second point. Adoption is a viable alternative to abortion and accomplishes the same result. Around 135,000 children are adopted every year in the United States. And nearly 1.5 million children have been adopted over the century. Point 3, an abortion can result in medical complications later in life. For example, the risk of ectopic pregnancies is increased. That's a pregnancy that occurs when a fertilized egg implants and grows outside the uterus, generally in the fallopian tube. Point 4. For women who demand complete control of their body or bodies, control should include preventing the risk of unwanted pregnancy through the responsible use of contraception. Now, what's the traditional Catholic view on contraception? Artificial contraception, no. There's something called the rhythm method. Depends on close tracking of the days when a female is most likely to be ovulating and avoiding intercourse during those days. So good Catholics who would wanting to control birth would be told to use the rhythm method. Anything else is considered artificial, and going back to St. Augustine, it is equivalent to abortion because the end result would be the same, except you're dealing with potential as opposed to actual. Now, how many of you knew that this position was held by mainline Protestant groups until 1930? There was something called the Lambeth Conference, a gathering of bishops of the Anglican Communion when it was ruled that followers could use birth control. Before that, it was pretty much similar to the Catholic position. Point 5, a more practical position. Many Americans who pay taxes are opposed to abortion. Therefore, it's morally wrong to use tax dollars to fund abortion. Point 6. Those who choose abortions are often minors or young women with insufficient life experience to understand fully what they are doing. And many have lifelong regrets afterward. That position is used to support the counseling aspect that some states require. Point 7. Abortion can cause, I think it says sometimes, it can cause psychological pain and stress. Here, a study of the medical records of 56,741 California Medicaid patients is cited, which revealed that women who had abortions were 160% more likely than delivering women to be hospitalized for psychiatric treatment in the first 90 days. I have not followed up on this study. Lots of studies are quoted, but this is one that is quoted. Rates of psychiatric treatment remain significantly higher for at least 4 years after the abortion. So those are some of the main arguments against. What are the pro-choice arguments? Number one, women choose to abort due to a number of difficult circumstances. Nobody aborts without a valid reason. Well, I don't know, you never say nobody, but the point is that abortion usually isn't done without some reason. If a woman is below the age of 21, she may be too young to have a baby. She may be immature and not in a position to take the responsibility of raising a new life. She may not even be able to provide for her child with everything that it requires. With a life to support, many girls drop out of school, start working in order to fend for the child, which often spells a bleak future for both mother and child. I know that's the case when I taught up in Vallejo. We were getting, sometimes middle school girls getting pregnant. And then what do you, at that point, if they have the child, the possibilities for those people moving forward in any way is very bleak. In any case. 2, a woman should have control over her own body and the right to privacy. That was the Roe v. Wade decision when it comes to decisions regarding her body. The right to an abortion should be an individual moral choice and not determined by government mandate. So you may say it's not, I don't support abortion, I could say that, but I support your right to make that moral decision. It shouldn't be made by the government. That's what this is saying. 3, nearly all abortions take place in the first trimester when a fetus is attached to the placenta and umbilical cord, and therefore it's not an independent life. An independent life would have to exist outside the womb. So you're talking about co-life. Co-life. 4, abortion is a safe medical procedure. Medical abortions have a very low risk of serious complications, do not affect a woman's health or future ability to become pregnant or give birth. And this is a main one, this subpoint. If medical abortion is illegal, backstreet abortions will take the lives of many women as they did in the past, especially among the poor. Before Roe v. Wade, women of means could find a physician to help, or they could fly to Switzerland. In the 1950s, access to safe hospital abortions was largely related to socioeconomic status and race. For example, in New York City, the abortion ratio in municipal hospitals caring for the poor was 1 per 1,000 births. The ratio was 6 times higher in private hospitals, if you could pay for it. So abortions took place 6 times more in private hospitals than in public hospitals in New York. Position 5, abortion is not generally used as a form of contraception. Pregnancy can occur even with contraceptive use. For women who have abortions, few women have abortions who do not use any form of birth control. It's often that it fails, or, oh, I forgot. Or, in worst case scenarios, I was forced. I wasn't planning when I went out to have sex, but then, I went to the bar and somebody put something in my drink. I woke up, and there's been a lot of cases like that. 6, adoption is not an alternative to abortion because it remains the woman's choice whether or not to give up her child for adoption. That means abortion eliminates that choice because it's been shown that less than 3% of white unmarried women and 2% of black unmarried women give up their babies. Do you see what that argument is? Once the child is born, they're not going to give it up for adoption. Very low. Very low. In the case of rape or incest, forcing a woman made pregnant by this violent act produces great psychological harm. 8, and this is an interesting one, the concept of personhood is different from the concept of human life. Fertilized eggs used for in vitro fertilization are also human lives, and those not implanted are routinely thrown away. Is this murder? If not, how is abortion murder? 9, and these 9 and 10 are a little bit, but I thought I'd throw them in since you might come across them. From a religious perspective, if God is so concerned about abortion, why is it that 2/3 of all human embryos fail to develop successfully and are naturally aborted? 2/3 of all fertilized eggs never make it to the uterus. Also, and this might be, but you'll find this argument, if an innocent fetus is granted immediate entry into heaven, what's the problem? I mean, that's an interesting one to think about. That's an interesting, depends on your concept of heaven, there's a lot of things there. But you'll find these. And then from a sociological perspective, another one that's kind of out there. No, this one is much more real. The last one's out there. From a sociological perspective, many of those who argue against abortion in the name of pro-life are hypocritical. In this regard, pro-choice advocates claim that it is hard to call yourself pro-life when you are actively working to imprison or execute women to have it for access to safe abortion, silence doctors or even kill them, strip reproductive health care from millions, stand by while maternal mortality rates skyrocket and women, especially black women, die in childbirth, cut programs that feed hungry kids, and incite far-right violence with lies about abortion. I mean, these are just their positions. I'm objective here. Now, this is the one that gets a little bit, but you might think about it. Some pro-choice advocates point out that over the last 50 years, it is estimated there have been over 2 billion abortions worldwide. Without abortion, this would put great extra strain on a planet already burdened by the problem of overpopulation and scarcity of resources. So that's some of the history related to the controversy and the basic positions. Thanks for coming, and have a good evening.